Okay, excellent. We'll get started. Welcome everyone to this IAQM webinar, Odour Assessment, Reflections on the Effectiveness of IAQM Guidance. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Michael Bull, an air quality consultant with over 35 years of experience. He has been involved with the IAQM since its inception, sitting on the IAQM committee until 2018, and has held several posts, including on membership secretary and vice chair. He also chaired the working group that produced the guidance that we're going to be talking about today. After Michael's presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will then read these out on your behalf later on. As you will see, this event is being recorded and will be made available on the IAQM website and IES YouTube channel in the next week or so. Thank you very much for logging in, and thanks to you, Michael, for presenting today. I'll hand over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm very pleased to have been invited today to talk about odour assessment for this IAQM webinar. And I was given a fairly open brief as to what I could talk about. But clearly the IAQM guidance should be the focus of this, given it's an IAQM meeting. And it is, in fact, 10 years since we started this development of the guidance. It was the first meetings we had to talk about this were held in 2012, and it was throughout 2013 and 14 that we prepared the guidance through a working group. And a draft was produced and circulated to the membership for initial publication of the first version of the guidance in 2014. And at that time, we promised that we would go back to the membership after it had some experience of the use of the guidance and update it if necessary. And again, a further version, the second version, was produced in 2018, which is the current version. So why did we do that? Why did we think guidance was necessary? Well, at the time, there was and still is the H4 guidance, the Environment Agency guidance, but that is specifically aimed at permitting and not at the planning regime. And we really did feel that it was appropriate that we produce some guidance that was aimed for the planning process, particularly as that's where a lot of our odour assessment work is directed. There was, at the time of the initial development, some guidance available from DEFRA, the local authority guidance for odours. There was commercial kitchen guidance, and there was a code of practice on a wastewater treatment plant, but they've withdrawn all of that in 2017. They don't seem to want to update that. So we're now in a situation where there's even less guidance than was available when we started, so even more reason why we should have that guidance available. There were other intentions for further guidance as well as filling the gap for planning. We wanted as a professional body to give guidance that would help improve the quality of odour assessment, and in particular provide some consistency across the industry. And there's some very good reasons why I think consistency is important in odour assessment, as we'll come on to in the subsequent part of the talks, particularly when we talk about standards, and you'll see that the way the standards are formulated means the consistent approach really would help. When we started off on the compilation of the guidance, I think we thought that we'd probably go in some depth on odour standards and be quite robust in our recommendations, but actually we once we started looking at that, we found it quite difficult to come down on any particular set of odour standards, but they are talked about quite a bit in the guidance, so we'll talk about that. And finally, we wanted to provide air quality assessments with advice on best practice for the assessment process, and that's common to all of our guidance. So what will I be reflecting on here? I'll be looking at standards, and I'll be talking in some depth about modelling, and in particular the selection of data that goes into modelling the emission data. But I would like to really stress that the guidance is not all about modelling, and indeed the guidance is very clear that it regards modelling as just one tool that can be used. And my view is that observational methods are really, really useful and are quite an essential part of odour assessment, where you're looking at existing processes. And then a few thoughts on what we don't know now, or what we really have got no obvious guidance on in terms of assessment. And there's one or two areas where I think that there could be some improvement in the guidance itself. And just to note that these are personal reflections and don't represent the views of the IAQM. The current guidance, I assume, is the current IAQM view on the world. So if we go back to what the guidance says on standards, it does talk quite a lot about the Environment Agency H4 standards, which hopefully most of you are familiar with. But just to remind you, the Environment Agency H4 guidance document sets 3 standards based on the offensiveness of the odour. So for a less offensive odour, it allows for more exposure to odour. So for less offensive odours, it talks about a standard of 6, but for the more offensive odours, then you look at a much more stringent standard of 1.5. But the guidance itself says an appropriate criterion could lie somewhere in the range of 1 to 10 as a 98th percentile of hourly mean. So the guidance doesn't really come down off the fence on that. Now, over the years, since the publication of that, and indeed before, you often hear proposals for other standards. Because I think the view is that the 98th percentile does allow you to, in a sense, get away with quite a lot in those 2% of the year that you're, in a sense, not looking at. And that odour nuisance can be caused by very short-term exposure, very quite infrequent exposure. So you often hear proposals coming forward for other standards, particularly those based on very short-term exposure, maybe over the extent of a few minutes or seconds even, and looking at maximum exposure, or possibly the number of hours exposed. And indeed, my understanding is ADMS is one model that's being developed to give you something similar to, it's being developed for some concept called odour hours, which is then going to give you a measure of exposure to odours. Now, all of those have very sensible reasons for thinking why another standard would be more appropriate. The problem with any other standard, as far as I can see, is that it's only the 98th percentile standard has any published research that really links community annoyance, so that's what the public perceive the odour, how annoying it is, with a modelled exposure value. It's all very well and good to come up with other proposals, but with the absence of that underlying research, it's very difficult to have any faith in another standard. And just going back to the evidence for the H4 standard, the diagram on the left comes out of an Environment Agency research document, Community Response to Odorous Emissions, which is a very good document if you want to look it up. And that gives the graph upon which they base the 3 levels of odour exposure and for their standards. But there is something very interesting to note from that graph and compared with the formulation of the standards. That is that the standards are based on the offensiveness of the odours, whereas this underlying research is based on the nature of the population exposed. So there are 3 types of population exposed. One is is people with an economic interest, which is labelled farmers within this. So they're obviously more tolerant, where there's so-called concentration and non-concentration areas, which relate to your expectation for the area. So a concentration area is one where there are plenty of, in this case, pig farms. And so you have an expectation you might come across pig farm odour in that area, whereas a non-concentration area is one where there is an absence of that activity. So the underlying research is not based on offensiveness, it's based on the nature of the population exposed. That said, if you look on the right-hand side, that's a bit of the Dutch research that was published generally in the 80s and 90s, which has related the 98th percentile of odour concentrations with a surveyed population of annoyance. So they have modelled odour exposure and they have done community surveys and related the two. Now, you can draw your own conclusions how well you think there is a fit there, but there is certainly a fit between some increasing exposure and observed annoyance. And there's another bit, same author here, another paper of theirs, which shows an increase in annoyance with increasing exposure. I think what is interesting here in this research is actually, if you look at this upper end, these relate to exposures you probably would never get for any length of time now, because you'd end up with a very highly annoyed community and some action being taken, which is part of the problem in doing the kind of research to establish these relationships, because you have to annoy a community to develop this relationship. But you'll see that there is some observed relationship there between exposure and annoyance. Questions have often been asked, why the 98th percentile? And I and several others have often thought that was because at the time these standards came forward, there was a 98th percentile NO2 standard. That was the statutory standard before our current air quality standards. And that seemed a sensible thing that maybe people had set up their models to calculate 98th percentiles, and therefore we can do this. But I did come across this justification for the standards in one of the well-known authors or well-known researchers of odour exposure, which I hoped would help. But actually, I think if you read that, it's quite difficult to understand exactly what they're getting at. I mean, it says 98th percentile uses a compromise between reliability and ability to discriminate, and higher percentiles are less reliable. My interpretation of this is that they recognise that odour nuisance is caused by quite short-term high odour concentrations that may only last rarely, but as a predictive parameter, that's quite a difficult thing to calculate, because it will be reliant, the maximum will be reliant on very specific meteorological conditions that may only happen once or twice. So they're looking for a balance between a high level of a higher maximum level and something which discriminates on a local basis. That's my interpretation. I'll leave you to decide whether I've got that correct or not. The one thing I would note, it does seem to be only the 98th percentile that's regularly tested, and we don't know whether there are other parameters that might actually fit that data better. Occasionally you see some higher percentiles used, but it does seem that the focus has been on the 98th percentile. And there is a bit of a suggestion there that they might just be confirming what they'd like to know in their own research, or they're confirming their proposition at the beginning and haven't really tested it that well. So how robust are the standards? And they're always, bear in mind that I'm relating this back to the statement in the guidance that the standard might lie between 1 and 10. So there are some reasons why you can think that being vague about the exposure level is a reasonable thing to do. And that's because if we look at how the EA standards have been developed, firstly, they're based on the offensiveness of the odour, but we've already seen the underlying research isn't. So it looks at 3 different types of population and for some reason puts that in terms of offensiveness of the odour. There is an issue which quite of interest to philosophers of science, of external validity. And that is really, can you take the research that was used to support the standard? Does that really apply to the situation you're looking at now? So temporally and spatially, is research that examined the response of exposure to pig farm odours in the 1990s in Holland, is that reasonably representative of, say, UK population exposed to sewage odours in 2022? Now, we don't know that, but it's a reasonable argument to say that they're not necessarily equivalent, and so they may have a very different response to odours. Finally, and I think this is really important when it comes to modelling, is that the modelling, remember, this is an unusual standard. This is a standard that's based around measured annoyance in the community with a specific modelled value. So they've modelled the situation and compared that with surveyed annoyance. And that modelling was almost certainly, there's not a lot of information around about it apart from the name of the model. And we could do with someone who was involved in the Dutch modelling at the time to really explain this a bit more. But it must have been carried out with an older style Gaussian model just because of the time it was carried out. And it was probably, I mean, inferring this on the name and some of the description of the research, it's probably what's called a long-term model. So those of you with very long memories, this is probably a model along the lines of ISCLT, which doesn't use hourly meteorological data, it uses statistical meteorological data and extrapolates the 98th percentile. So it's an older style model, probably a long-term model, can we honestly say that the relationship that was observed for the model, that model, is going to be exactly the same as what we'd see now using AirMod and ADMS, which are the preferred models these days for doing odor assessments, and generally using hourly emission data? Now, my view is that that's pretty unlikely, but there is some underlying reason to think that 98th percentile has got some relationship with odor nuisance. So that's a summary of my views on that. If I look now at, there is supporting references that are often used to support the standards that are used. There are two I come across quite often. One is the UK Water Industry Research Study, the UKWIR Study, which is a 2002 study, which looked at complaint and again, modeled odor exposure. And they came up with these conclusions. Essentially, that the majority of the complaints were where there was exposure above 10 odor units as a 98th percentile, but there was a significant fraction between 5 and 10. And I think you also have to bear in mind at the time the water industry was really promoting a standard that was 5 and occasionally 10 in some cases. So there was some element of trying to justify these standards. So this was, firstly, this was a study that was very well known and quite well respected, and it's all well and good. But there's two major things about this study. One is complaints are not the same as surveyed annoyance. Remember, the Environment Agency ones are based on community surveys, whereas complaint is effectively a self-reported survey. And it's a very different population that complains to those that are actively surveyed. The second thing which really surprised me when I finally looked at this study is just how little information there is about the study in the document. And with the exception of that bit of text on the main conclusions, essentially this is it within the study. So there is the reported number of complaints within different odor exposure levels, 9 completely unknown sewage treatment works somewhere. We know nothing about the modelling. We know nothing about how the modelling was done. We don't know if this is library odor emission data. We don't know if it's surveyed odor emission data. Nothing at all, which is quite important. Particularly, we don't know what these sites are. We don't really know what our expectations are for those sites. So if there is no exposure, for instance, nearby, then you wouldn't expect many complaints. The other thing to also note from the research is actually there are no many complaints at any of these sites, which is a bit of a problem, I feel, because they're not giving you an awful lot of information. Now, myself and a colleague some years ago, we did our own version of this, which was published in Water and Environment Journal, and you can go away and have a look at this. And we tried the same thing. This was modelling using ADMS. Where we collated complaints information and modelled using library odor emission data to see whether we could see a relationship between odor exposure. And you'll see that we came up with a very different conclusion. But one of the actual interesting conclusions is that if you look on the right-hand side of that, actually is in quite a lot of cases, there were complaints well outside any of the exposure bands that we were testing. So people were complaining either because they were complaining about the wrong thing and weren't actually exposed, or quite likely in some cases they were complaining about some one-off events that wouldn't have been picked up with the odor modelling. So there is in terms of the UKWIR study, I think you should consider the context of what's available within that in terms of supporting it. CIWEM also produced a policy position paper. This was produced in 2012. It was produced by their air panel, and I was sitting on the air panel at the time they did that. And essentially, CIWEM policy position paper rehashes the UKWIR research and talks about other experience. And what it talks about, which is quite often done, including in the Environment Agency H4 justification, is that there will often be talk about other studies we have done, in terms of the consultancy that did it or the researcher that has done it, but have been very unspecific about those studies. They're not very transparent about where that information comes from. So it's I would say that the Sci-1 position paper is simply really a regurgitation of UKWIR and it's certainly not based on any new information. So they should be viewed as one and the same justification. I think in terms of modelling, the IAQM guidance has been useful in providing a much more consistent framework for modelling approaches. It's still, like any guidance document, if you give the same guidance document to a group of people, they'll interpret it in a way that they will say that they like. They'll make their own interpretation of that. And there are still some issues about that which result in potentially less consistency in modelling. And I'm going to talk about the first of those mostly, which is the assessment of odour emission rates. But there are other also issues coming along, selection of model. You get differences in model predictions between ADMS and AirMod. So, which one maybe do you use? And there is also a lot of interest in Cairns processing and metadata selection for odour modelling, because those are quite important in terms of 98th percentile calculations. I'm not going to talk about those at all, because my understanding is there's quite a bit of research going on anyway, particularly in terms of metadata selection for air quality modelling generally. And I think that's going to be coming out soon, which will help us inform on that. But again, I think this comes back, I'll keep coming back to why we're a bit vague in the guidance about the standards you apply. And I think that is because you can't really think of modelling as necessarily that precise an activity. And this relates particularly to odour emission rates, which for odour assessment, we usually take from surveys or library sources. And if you surveyed, you're probably using a combination of surveys and library sources, because you would concentrate in the survey on the most important sources. So there are various places where you can get library odour emission rates from. There's several published studies. A lot of companies compile their own databases, and indeed, if you look on my website, there's a publicly available compilation of odour emission rates from other studies. But one of the features about odour emission rates is that because they're generally smelly stuff, often is from a biological source. A biological source isn't necessarily a very stable source, so there can be a significant variation in reported values, just because biology is influenced by several external factors. And these are values that I've taken for sewage works out of my database. Now, my database has got around 40 sewage works in, although because sewage works use different processes, not all of them are using the same process. So, but you can see within the database, there are some quite staggering differences in the variations in library values. I'll point particularly at the primary tanks, because that's one where it is very influenced by the state of the sewage entering the works. So there are some big ranges, and in fact, I'm pointing out there that there's almost 4 orders of magnitude difference there, which is a bit frightening in some respects. But I think more reassuringly, generally, you see this cluster of more frequent occurrence of odour emission rates around the centre. So if you, again, concentrate back on the primary tanks, you'll see that there is quite a big peak here. And so I think we can have confidence that there is a generally reasonable area of odour emission rates, but there may be some particular local circumstances where there are some process upsets or some process conditions that give rise to very high conditions. And what I've been doing lately in my odour assessments, when I've been doing wastewater treatment works, is I've been selecting percentile values out of my library. So I've been saying, well, we know there's variation, so I'm going to take that into account. I will say select a 70th percentile value for odour emission rate and use that. Then I can be confident that probably most of the time I'm going to be right. It is interesting, I did, because I was doing one recently, I'd set the spreadsheet up to let me do this easy. I did just see what the effects of various different percentile selections was. So starting with a median and going up to the 100th percentile, you see a very big range there. I would take the 100th percentile with a pinch of salt. Well, not necessarily a pinch of salt, they're real numbers, but the 100th percentile will relate to some very specific conditions, probably where there's been a process upset or some very dramatic poor management of the plant going on there. What is interesting, I think, and again gives me more confidence in my my selection of around 70 to 80%, is there is a relationship observed between the capacity of the works and population equivalent and overall odour emission rates. And this particular works, which isn't the one in the picture, by the way, has a population equivalent of around 30,000. So the relationship says that you would probably expect that the overall odour emission rate to be between 0.5 and 1 times the population equivalent. So I think we can be reasonably confident that a value around 70 to 80% of the percentile is giving us a decent projection of what we would expect for an overall emission rate. But it is clear that the base choice of odour emission rate is significant. And I know a number of you might leap into the air and say, well, these are library rates, so if you go out and survey, it's going to be much easier. Well, I've got one site where we did 2 surveys. Again, not this site, and in the picture, and you'll see that between 2 surveys there was a dramatic difference in emissions from particularly the inlet works, which was because on the survey on one occasion the inlet works, the septicity control wasn't working at all well. The interesting thing about the 2 surveys is that even though they individually the overall odour emission rates were quite different from the process, it's actually overall, when you calculated them out, they were quite similar. They were within about 10% of each other, the total odour emission rate. So maybe there's some benefit there. So just in conclusion, you know, on the odour emission rates, they're subject to some wide variation, and therefore, you know, some judgment is required in selection. But what I think that judgment is much more important than any subsequent tinkering around with overall emission rates. People do tend to, particularly on sewage works, tend to adjust them for turbulence. On various processes, they might adjust for seasonality or for diurnal variations, but that is the initial choice is going to be much more important than those little subsequent tinkering. And you do have to acknowledge within the guidance, we noted this then, that you can't, you know, modeling's a tool. It's not necessarily very accurate and precise, but it adds to the body of evidence. And one of the things I really like about the guidance is it does say that for an existing process, the observational methods should be given considerable weight. And observational methods are these, which are complaints analysis, sniff testing, and community surveys. I'd have to say I've never seen a community survey done within the UK, although one of my colleagues was asked if they could do one by a local authority recently. I don't think that's going to happen. And within limits, some of these are really useful tools. I think complaints analysis, particularly if you're doing modelling, is very good. Certainly will confirm a problem. It's possibly less so to confirm the absence of a problem. But even so, if you look at complaints and you know that there is you know, potentially a lot of exposure there and no complaints, you're building up evidence that you know, perhaps there isn't a problem. But sniff testing is, I've got to use this joke, it's not something to be sniffed at, I think, here. Sniff testing is really quite useful, I think, possibly suffers from a bit of an image problem, but is a much more practical tool for odour assessment of existing processes. If you've got your process there, you might as well go out and see what it smells like, because that's what the community is experiencing as well. And unless you do that, I think just using modelling, you could open yourself up to some criticism and being looked like an idiot if your sniff test show that it smells when you're modelling suggests it doesn't. It disappoints me that some planning authorities and water companies won't accept sniff testing very much. But there is precedent in public inquiry. This is one here in Farnham, and here the inspector accepted, even though the water company was pushing very hard for odour modelling, they accepted, well, this person's been out and done loads of sniff testing and they couldn't smell it. So that seems pretty good evidence to me that it's not a problem. And I would really commend to anyone looking to specify what should go into an odour assessment is don't just stop at modelling. These other observational tools are very useful in themselves. One of the common features of all guidance that's being published is this talk about fiddle factors. And there are, in the IAQM guidance, we talk about some qualitative assessment processes, and this is one of them. And FIDO or FIDDLE is talked about quite a bit. But one of the things I find quite interesting about all the guidance is none of it tells you how to use this to know whether you've got a problem or not. It certainly specifies what these things, what the 5 factors mean, but it doesn't tell you how to tie those 5 factors together into a framework to tell you, yes, you've got a problem or not. And indeed, it's in some of it says, that it's not necessarily, you might get a problem from just very short-term, single one-off high odor exposure, or you might get a problem from chronic low-level odor exposure. So it's quite difficult to know how to use this. So, I mean, that's the description of the factors there. And all of those factors can be in an objective manner to an extent assessed, and there are some suggested descriptions. Some of this comes from guidance, particularly the SEPA guidance is quite good on this. And I had a public inquiry recently where we had a good argument over using these. And you can see it's quite easy for a user to come along and put numbers or put an assessment into each of these boxes. It's very difficult then, I suppose, except if they're all bad, to come up with some outcome from that assessment. It is quite out, and I only just noticed this when I put this tool together in terms of location. I think in terms of location, I think that this is from the SEPA guidance. It probably comes out with a very different idea from what you would do, which might just be looking at the individual sensitivity of a receptor. And as I say, the guidance falls back on the points to the difficulties in using FIDO, and how the different exposures can give rise to different levels of nuisance. And all of this guidance relies on professional judgment, and there isn't a lot of consistency of outcome, which I recently experienced at a public inquiry where I was one expert, and we were using both FIDO and source pathway receptor analysis, where we looked at a particular process. And this is just the one area I'd highlight in the IAQM guidance that I think that we need to look at, because within SPR assessment, there is this matrix framework. And if you look at the matrix, in terms of source odor potential, you can really only get a problem really from a large odor source, possibly with a medium one, but it would suggest that a small odor source is unlikely to give a problem. Now, I would suggest to you that's not the case. And one of the principal reasons I say that is that one of the things I come across most frequently in terms of odor problems is something like a restaurant, which is quite clearly much smaller than a Part B process, might only be considered mildly odorous, might have some quite effective mitigation, but it does quite often give rise to odor problems. And these is one of the most frequent sources that give rise to such nuisance. And I think we really need to probably look at that SPR matrix to understand how it should be used in a better way. That's because I thought I was right at the public inquiry. Obviously, the other consultant had their own views as well. So the one final issue that I'm just going to quickly talk about is that the other thing I come across quite frequently is the one issue that's difficult to resolve is the problem of combining sources. So it is quite frequent in odor assessment that you have a continuous source with an occasional intermittent strong source superimposed on it. And the two I would highlight, one is the sewage works, where you have your water treatment processes just generally purring along, a bit odorous, and then perhaps a sludge tanker will come along, or that they'll do some process where they clear tanks, and you get a very high peak of odor. Intensive animal rearing is another, where you get continuous emissions from the housing over a rearing cycle, and at the end of the cycle that stops. They then clear the house, and clearing the house of the accumulated litter is pretty odorous as well. So how do you do that? Now, I do see people incorporating the occasional intermittent source into the modelling, but I think that doesn't work. Because the 98th percentile metric misses those very high short-term odor peaks. And remember, those intermittent emissions may only be for a few hours each week. And if the 98th percentile isn't really looking much at the top 170 odd hours of that. So if you put it into a model, you might only shift the 98th percentile metric a bit, but you'll miss those high odor peaks. My suggestion would be that you assess them separately, possibly using modeling for the occasional strong source, just to look at standard Met conditions to see what impact they have. But certainly not within a 98th percentile metric. But I think it is one thing that is difficult. The other similar problem would be where you have two odor sources that are entirely different. So if you have two odor sources, and I, for instance, relatively recently did one where we had an abattoir and a sewage works next to each other. How do you combine those? They're two different odor sources. Are they additive? In fact, guidance suggests that odors don't necessarily add together. But it is a difficult thing that I think we could usefully look at in guidance, how we can do that. My time is up. In fact, I think I've gone a bit over time. That's my contact details. I'm very pleased that you all joined. Always glad to see how well attended these events are, and I will be more than happy to attempt to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michael, for that presentation. And yes, attendees, please do put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll kick off with the first question now. It's quite a long one, but for the benefit of other attendees, I'll read it out to you first, Michael, if you don't mind. There is a paragraph in the IAQM guidance which states odours from sewage treatment works plant operating normally would not be expected to be at the most offensive end of the spectrum and can be considered on par with moderately offensive odours. H4 and IAQM guidance has an associated benchmark threshold of C98 1 hour 30 U per metre cubed, and Table 7 presents the matrices for interpreting modelled odour contours against this threshold. Table 6 for 1.50 U per metres cubed. 1.50 U per metres cubed is the most stringently applied threshold, particularly forming the default position for LPAs when reviewing odour assessment. What is your judgment on when, if ever, to apply 3 OU per metres cubed as a threshold for modelling sewage-related odour instead?
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. This comes up quite a lot, and I've certainly been at several public inquiries where we've had a discussion about what is the most appropriate odour standard to apply. I think there are some cases where this is quite clear. So the 1.580 unit standard is applicable, I think is applicable, they say in the H4 guidance, relating to sludge or septic sewage. Now, there are certainly some sewage works, in fact, quite a few sewage works, where you wouldn't expect to see septicity in any level, and they don't handle sludge at any level. So if you do, let's do the most simple ones, a small rural works, you would have a very small catchment. There would be unlikely to be any septicity in the main of any description. And that the processes would operate at quite a low rate. So I think there you could reasonably apply a 3 odour unit threshold. I think the difficulty comes with larger works where there is potential for septicity or there is sludge handling and processing. And I think my advice there would be is to go back and look when you do your compilation of odour emission rates and look at each of the individual contributions from the processes. You're seeing the majority of the odour coming from the inlet works and primary treatment, primary settlement tanks, which is where you would expect to see septicity mainly, or if there's some sludge processing going on, that you can see that as well. If you're seeing the majority or a good contribution from that is coming from things that are potentially septic or using sludge, then I think 1.5 is a standard that will be applied. I think you'll also find different water companies do take a different view on this. So there are some water companies who will ask for 1.5. Currently, I believe, for instance, Southern Water are asking for 1.5. So you do also have to take into account the preference of the water company if there is one involved. But I think go back and look at your odour emission rates and see what you've got. If you've gone out and measured them, you'll also probably get some information, because most measurement surveys these days, they will take hydrogen sulfide measurements as well when they're doing the olfactometry survey, so you can see whether there's septicity in the mains in the process there as well.
Amazing, thanks very much, Michael. Got some other questions coming through now. You briefly mentioned about choice of model. ADMS/air mod differences seem to be exacerbating when using area sources. What items would you consider if you needed to choose between two alternative contours?
Right. So I think the first thing to consider is, well, how close are you to your adopted standard? I think if you're drawing a line and you're saying one side of it's okay and the other, and I'm going to put housing and the other side isn't, you need to be quite careful about that. And I think the choice between model is one of those areas where sensitivity might come in. In principle, the choice of model shouldn't affect the outcome of your assessment. And if it is so sensitive to the choice of model, the one model is saying it's okay and the other is not, I think you've got to go back to that advice and the guidance. There's only one tool that helps you assess odours. And if it is such a marginal decision, then I think you've got to consider that there is a risk if your outcome is dependent on the model selection. So I think looking at your odour emission rates and a sensitivity study on odour emission rates should allow you to make a much more robust decision and not worry so much about the selection of the odour model there.
Great, perfect. Thank you for that. We've got another question here from an attendee who says they're new to this area, but they're wondering, does the modelling take into account meteorological or air temperature inversions and geographical features? For context, the seasonal increase of complaints within narrow valley geography at times of cold snap, for example.
Yes, to an extent it does. Within the context of any modelling, dispersion modelling, those tools have got a facility to take into account topography. They can take into account temperature inversion, possibly less important for odour because you're looking at a very near field conditions. Although I think in terms of weather conditions, actually that's much more important when you're looking at some of the observational methods you use, is to select your weather conditions appropriately for when you're doing sniff testing, to try and bring in the worst case ones there.
That makes sense. Thanks, Michael. And I think we've got time to just squeeze in one more question if you're happy.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in the short term, high emissions could not be reflected in the 98th percentile metric. Can we not argue that this reflects on expected tolerance to short-term episodes?
Yeah, I think you could make that argument. I think the argument that how I've always considered the 98th percentile metric is that it represents a level of odour exposure which has been observed in the community, that there is a level of annoyance. So the 98th percentile 3 odour units represents, we know that there is an exposure that's at a higher level within that, and therefore we could argue exactly what's there, that it expects I'm not necessarily sure it expects an intolerance to short-term episodes. I just think that it could be argued that 98th percentile parameter represents a level of exposure over a year that gives rise to a potential nuisance. The one caveat I'd put against that is when I was at ARAP, we did a bit of research with that, where we attempted to look at whether there was a relationship between a calculated 98th percentile and frequency of short-term exposure, and we didn't see that. I think there is the jury is out a bit on that. I'd just quickly like to, I've seen Nick Sawyer's put in something, and Nick was involved in the Environment Agency guidance. He just correctly pointed out the H4 refers to benchmarks in terms of that. So that's true. I use the term standards, and I think in a loose fashion, but they are being used as kind of yes/no decision-making standards for planning decisions. And as you see from one of the questions there, that that water companies and local authorities are using these as decision-making thresholds for planning.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thanks for answering those questions. I'm afraid it's all we have time for today, but as you can see, Michael's contact details are there on the slide. Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. The next IES webinar is going to be held on the 12th of July, and this is on the nature tool, quickly assessing natural capital for EIAs. And you can register for this on the IES website. Thank you once again to our speaker, Michael, for taking the time to come and talk to us today, and for all of you for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.